Elena Carter's mornings always began the same way. The cold wind bit at her skin as she pedaled through the narrow, bumpy roads leading out of her small neighborhood, her bicycle, rusty, creaky, and missing a bell, was her most trusted companion, carrying her to Wellington Academy every day. The school loomed ahead, a grand institution known for housing the children of the country's wealthiest families. Its gates were wide and imposing, standing as a stark reminder that Elena did not belong. She slowed her bike as she neared the entrance, watching as sleek black limousines and expensive sports cars rolled up to the curb. Students stepped out, dressed in the latest designer brands, their laughter light and carefree, as if they had never known struggle. Elena swallowed hard, gripping the handlebars a little tighter. From the crowd of privileged teenagers, a voice rang out, high-pitched and dripping with amusement. "Oh, look! The charity case is here!" Elena didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Maddie Sinclair, her relentless tormentor, strutted toward her with her usual entourage of followers, her golden hair shining in the sunlight like a crown. Everything about Maddie screamed wealth. Her shoes cost more than Elena's entire wardrobe, and the purse dangling from her wrist was probably worth more than the tiny house she shared with her grandmother. Elena kept her head down, pushing her bike toward the racks, but Maddie wasn't done. "Still riding that pile of scrap metal, Elena?" Maddie smirked, crossing her arms. "Tell me, do you have to pedal harder when it rains? Or do you just get off and push?" The group around her burst into laughter. Elena's grip tightened on her bike, but she said nothing. There was no point. Maddie would only escalate things if she responded. Maddie stepped closer, tilting her head in mock curiosity. "I mean, seriously, how did you even get in here? This school is for people like me, not whatever you are." Elena forced herself to breathe. She wouldn't give Maddie the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she focused on the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the distant hum of car engines, the rhythmic beat of her heart as she counted in her mind. Maddie sighed dramatically. "Oh well, maybe one of the teachers felt sorry for you, or maybe," her eyes gleamed with wicked delight, "maybe you begged some rich man to pay for you. Did you get some rich man to pay for you? Did you get on your knees, Elena?" The laughter around them was deafening. Elena's face burned, but she still refused to look at Maddie. Just then, a new voice cut through the air. "That's enough, Maddie." Elena looked up to see Nate Hayes standing nearby, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Maddie rolled her eyes. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Don't tell me you're feeling sorry for her. It's not my fault she was born poor." "Yeah." Nate's voice was calm, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "Well, it's not her fault you were born a miserable human being." The group of students gasped, their eyes darting between Maddie and Nate. Maddie's confident smirk faltered for just a second before she forced out a laugh. "Wow, I see what's happening," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "You're trying to be the hero. How adorable." Nate didn't reply, but the way he looked at Maddie, like she wasn't worth another second of his time, made her cheeks turn pink. Elena exhaled slowly, grateful for the unexpected intervention. but she knew better than to believe Maddie would stop. Maddie was like a storm, destructive and impossible to ignore, and she always came back stronger. Sure enough, as Elena walked toward the school entrance, Maddie's voice followed her. Enjoy it while you can, Elena, because girls like you, they always get crushed in the end. Elena kept walking, but her chest felt heavy. She had been fighting to survive in this school for too long. And deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Elena's dedication to her studies was unmatched at Wellington Academy. While others spent their afternoons lounging by pools or shopping at exclusive boutiques, she buried herself in textbooks at the old wooden desk in her bedroom. The creaking ceiling fan spun lazily above her as she flipped through pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. Academic excellence was her ticket to a better future, a key that could unlock doors money never could. The walls of the school hallways were adorned with framed certificates, and Elena's name appeared on more than a few of them. Each award ceremony was a silent triumph for her, a validation of her hard work and perseverance. However, with every accolade she received, Maddie Sinclair's resentment grew. Maddie couldn't fathom how a girl who rode a rusty bicycle and wore faded hand-me-downs could outshine her in any way. One sunny afternoon, as the school assembled for the monthly awards ceremony, the principal, Mr. Harris, took to the stage. His voice boomed through the microphone, announcing the recipients of various academic honors. Elena's name was called multiple times, her achievements in science and literature drawing applause from teachers and a few supportive classmates. But the loudest reaction came from Maddie's clique, their sarcastic claps and whispered jabs piercing through the applause. Elena stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted each certificate. The recognition felt good, but the weight of Maddie's glare from the audience was heavy. Maddie sat with her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, seething at the sight of Elena's success. During lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with chatter about the awards. Elena sat alone at the corner table, a simple sandwich and an apple, her only meal. She didn't mind the solitude. It was peaceful, yet peace was a luxury she rarely afforded herself at Wellington. Maddie, flanked by her entourage, sauntered over to Elena's table, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. "Look at you," Maddie sneered, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Collecting awards like they actually matter. Do you think a few pieces of paper will change the fact that you're still poor?" Elena kept her gaze on her food, unwilling to engage. Maddie leaned closer, the scent of her expensive perfume almost suffocating. "No matter how smart you think you are, you'll always be the charity case. While the rest of us are out enjoying our lives, you're stuck with your nose in a book because that's all you'll ever have." A couple of Maddie's friends giggled, their laughter as hollow as their words. But amidst the crowd, Danny Brooks watched in silence. Danny was the golden boy of Wellington Academy, athletic, handsome, and genuinely kind. Unlike many others, he saw beyond social status and material wealth. The way Maddie tormented Elena never sat right with him. As Maddie continued her tirade, Danny stood up from his table, his tray clattering onto the counter. He strode over, placing himself between Elena and Maddie. "Why do you care so much about her, Maddie?" he asked, his voice firm but calm. Maddie faltered, momentarily taken aback. "Excuse me?" Danny crossed his arms. You're always in her face, mocking her, trying to make her feel small. But the truth is, Elena's better than all of us. She works harder, achieves more, and does it without belittling anyone else. The cafeteria fell silent, the weight of Danny's words hanging in the air. Maddie's face flushed a deep crimson, a mixture of anger and embarrassment flickering in her eyes. "Oh, how noble of you, Danny," she snapped, playing the hero for the poor girl. "What's next? Are you going to tutor her out of the kindness of your heart?" Danny didn't flinch. "Maybe I will. Maybe we should all learn something from Elena. Like how to be decent human beings." Maddie's friends exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to respond without further igniting Danny's ire. Maddie's lips pressed into a thin line as she realized she was losing control of the narrative. "Fine," she spat, turning on her heel. "Keep playing the saint, Danny. But don't think for a second that it changes anything." As Maddie stormed off, her entourage reluctantly followed, leaving a trail of whispered apologies in their wake. Danny turned to Elena, offering a gentle smile. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Danny." He shrugged modestly. "You deserve better than how she treats you." For the first time in a long while, Elena felt seen, not as a charity case or a scholarship student, but as a person worthy of respect. And in that fleeting moment, a spark of hope flickered within her. However, Maddie's retreat was not a surrender. It was the brewing of a storm, a silent promise that her reign of terror was far from over. Elena knew the peace was temporary, a calm before Maddie unleashed a new wave of torment. Yet, bolstered by Danny's kindness and the quiet strength within her, Elena resolved to face whatever came next with her head held high. The battle had only just begun, but for the first time, Elena felt she wasn't fighting alone. Rumors had a way of spreading like wildfire at Wellington Academy. By the following morning, whispers of Danny Brooks standing up for Elena, Carter had reached every corner of the school. Some found it amusing, others shocking, but no one was more furious than Maddie Sinclair. Sitting in the lavishly decorated common area reserved for the school's elite, Maddie seethed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the surface of her phone. She had spent years crafting her image, making sure everyone knew she was superior in every way: her wealth, her influence. And yet, in a single moment, Elena, the charity case, had taken the spotlight. Maddie wouldn't let it stand. That morning, as Elena walked into school, she immediately felt the shift in energy. The usual stares she ignored now carried something different: curiosity, judgment, and in some cases, pity. A group of students whispered amongst themselves as she passed, and when she approached her locker, she noticed two girls suddenly go silent, exchanging glances before one of them smirked. Elena swallowed hard, trying to ignore it, but then she saw it, the writing on her locker in bold red ink. Scholarship slit. Her stomach twisted. The word burned itself into her mind, but she refused to let the humiliation consume her. Taking a deep breath, she pulled out a napkin from her bag and started wiping it away. But before she could erase the cruel message completely, a voice pierced through the hallway. "Well, well, well, I guess people are finally starting to see the truth." Elena froze, then turned slowly to face Maddie, who stood with her arms crossed, Her lips curled into a wicked smile. Elena kept her voice steady. What truth, Maddie? Maddie leaned in, her voice just loud enough for the growing crowd of students to hear. That you didn't get into this school because of your brains. You must have convinced someone to let you in, right? Maybe a desperate old man who likes poor girls. Gasps filled the hallway. Some students laughed, others shifted uncomfortably. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had endured Maddie's cruelty before, but this was different. This was vile. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. You're pathetic, Maddie, she said, her voice unwavering. You think spreading lies about me. You think spreading lies about me makes you powerful. It only proves how insecure you are. Maddie's smile wavered. She had expected Elena to shrink away, not fight back. Oh, please. Maddie scoffed. We all know girls like you do whatever it takes to get ahead. Admit it. There's no way you belong here otherwise. A hush fell over the crowd. Elena could feel the weight of every stare, the anticipation hanging thick in the air. She wanted to scream, to tell them all how hard she had worked, how she had earned every bit of her place at Wellington Academy. But she knew Maddie wouldn't let her speak. Then from behind the crowd, another voice rang out. Are you serious right now, Maddie? The students parted slightly as Danny Brooks strode forward, his eyes dark with anger. He didn't look at Elena. His gaze was locked on Maddie. Maddie blinked, then smirked. Danny, she cooed, flipping her hair. So nice of you to join us. I was just explaining to Elena how. You were just humiliating her for no reason, Danny interrupted, his tone sharp. Maddie's face twisted. I was just stating facts. Danny took another step closer, his jaw tight. You know what I think, Maddie. I think you're terrified. Maddie scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. Terrified. Of what? Danny gestured around the hallway. Of losing. Of someone actually being better than you without needing money to prove it. You're scared that Elena, someone you consider beneath you, someone you consider beneath you, is smarter, stronger, and doesn't need to tear others down to feel important. The crowd murmured. Maddie's face burned red. I don't have to listen to this, she snapped, spinning on her heel. But before she could storm off, Nate Hayes, her former best friend, who had been watching from the sidelines, spoke up. You should, Nate said coolly, because he's right. Maddie froze. For a brief second, the invincible girl who ruled Wellington Academy faltered. But then she straightened, her usual venom returning. Enjoy your moment, she spat at Elena before walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Elena turned to Danny. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Danny shrugged. Yeah, I did. Elena exhaled, looking down at the faint red smudge still on her locker. Despite everything, she wasn't broken. If anything, she felt stronger. But deep down, she knew Maddie wasn't done. This was just the beginning. The next morning, as Elena parked her bicycle near the school gates, she noticed something unusual. A sleek black car, the kind that belonged to the wealthiest families in the city, sat idling by the curb. The tinted window rolled down slightly, revealing a man in his late 40s. He had sharp features, a neatly trimmed beard, and gold-rimmed glasses that caught the morning sunlight. His eyes scanned the students walking past, but there was something calculating about the way he looked at Maddie Sinclair, who was just a few feet away, leaning casually against the railing. Elena didn't mean to stare, but something about the interaction felt off. Maddie, the girl who prided herself on acting untouchable, suddenly seemed nervous. She was fiddling with her phone, her polished nails tapping the screen too quickly, as if trying to avoid eye contact with the man. Then, the man's smooth voice broke the morning silence. "Maddie, darling, don't forget what we talked about." Maddie's eyes darted around the schoolyard before she forced a tight smile and gave a small nod. "I know," she said quickly, brushing her hair behind her ear. "I'll call you later." The man chuckled, a sound too casual for the tension hanging between them. "Make sure you do." With that, the car's window rolled up, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving Maddie standing rigid, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She took a deep breath, turned, and adjusted her posture, smoothing down her designer blazer, as if nothing had happened. Elena frowned. She had known Maddie to be a lot of things: cruel, arrogant, entitled, but never nervous. Whoever that man was, he had some kind of control over her. As Elena locked up her bicycle, she heard a voice behind her. "Caught something interesting, scholarship girl?" She turned to find Maddie standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. There was no smirk this time, no playful malice, just sharp, defensive anger. Elena met her glare without flinching. "Who was that?" Maddie scoffed. "None of your business." But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her. Elena had been on the receiving end of Maddie's cruelty for years, and yet, in this moment, it was Maddie who seemed uncomfortable. "Look," Elena said, keeping her voice even. "I don't care what's going on with you. She hesitated before finishing. I just hope you're okay." Maddie's eyes darkened. "I don't need your pity." Elena shook her head. "It's not pity. It's just..." She sighed. "Never mind." She turned to walk away, but Maddie's voice stopped her. "Stay out of my business, Elena." Elena glanced back. "I wasn't in your business, Maddie. You just made it very obvious that something's wrong." For a split second, a flicker of something, fear, doubt, uncertainty, passed over Maddie's face. Then just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the same cold arrogance. "Just worry about yourself, bicycle girl." Elena didn't reply. Instead, she walked toward the main building, her mind buzzing with questions. Who was that man? And why did he make Maddie, the queen of Wellington Academy, so uneasy? By lunchtime, the incident was still weighing on her. She had taken a seat at the far end of the cafeteria, away from the usual chaos, when Danny Brooks slid into the seat across from her. "You okay?" he asked, pulling an apple from his tray. Elena blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah." "Why?" Danny shrugged. "You seem distracted." She debated whether or not to say anything, but found herself blurting out, "Do you know anything about Maddie's family?" Danny raised an eyebrow. "Besides the fact that they own half the city, not much." Elena shook her head. "No, I mean, have you ever met her father?" Danny frowned, chewing thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, no, actually, people talk about him a lot, but I don't think I've ever seen him at any school events. Just her mom. Elena nodded slowly. That in itself wasn't unusual. Many wealthy families had parents too busy to attend school functions, but there was something unsettling about what she had witnessed that morning. Danny studied her. Why? What happened? Elena hesitated. I saw her talking to this man outside school today. He called her darling and told her not to forget what they talked about. She looked really uncomfortable. Danny's expression darkened slightly. That's weird. I know. They sat in silence for a moment before Danny leaned back in his chair, tossing his apple from one hand to the other. You think Maddie's hiding something? Elena sighed. I don't know, but I do know that for someone who spends her life making everyone else feel small, she sure looked powerless today. Danny exhaled, shaking his head. Maddie Sinclair, powerless? That's a terrifying thought. Elena offered a small, dry smile. Yeah, it is. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Maddie was hiding something, and whatever it was, it had the power to shake her to her core. Elena had always known Maddie was cruel, but now she was starting to believe Maddie was desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. The next few days at Wellington Academy felt heavier than usual. Though Maddie hadn't directly confronted Elena since their brief exchange outside school, the tension between them was palpable. It was in the way Maddie's eyes followed Elena through the halls, the way whispers always seemed to start up whenever she walked by, the way Maddie's clique snickered behind their manicured hands, as if they knew something Elena didn't. Elena ignored it at first. She had learned long ago that reacting only fed Maddie's hunger for control. But when she returned to her locker on Thursday afternoon, her patience cracked. Inside, her textbooks had been ripped apart. Pages were shredded, torn at the seams, ink smeared across them in what looked like deliberate attempts to erase her notes. But that wasn't the worst part. Stuffed between the ruined books was a crumpled envelope, and when Elena opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a single $100 bill and a note scrawled in looping, arrogant handwriting. Here, since you seem so desperate for a rich man to take care of you. Elena's stomach twisted, heat rising to her face. She clenched the note in her fist, her heart hammering. Maddie, this had Maddie written all over it. She turned on her heel, her pulse roaring in her ears, marching straight down the hallway. She didn't care who was watching, who was whispering. She was done letting Maddie push her around. She found her exactly where she expected to, leaning against the lockers, surrounded by her followers, laughing as if she had never done a cruel thing in her life. Elena stormed up to her and threw the crumpled bill at her feet. You think this is funny? She snapped. The group went silent. Maddie, ever the actress, blinked at her in mock innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. Elena's jaw clenched. You trashed my locker. You left that disgusting note. Do you really have nothing better to do than try to humiliate me? Maddie smirked, bending down to pick up the bill, flipping it between her fingers. Oh, I was just trying to help, she said sweetly. I figured you could use it. Who knows? Maybe if you save enough, you can buy a new life, one where you actually belong. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but it was hesitant this time, unsure. The scene unfolding in front of them wasn't the usual game of Maddie taunting and Elena taking it. This was different. Elena exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay calm. She met Maddie's gaze head on, refusing to back down. "You act like you own this place," she said, her voice steady. "Like you're better than everyone just because you have money. But the truth is, Maddie, you don't even know who you are without it, do you?" Maddie's smirk twitched. Elena stepped closer. "You spend so much time tearing me down because you think it makes you stronger. But it doesn't. It just proves how weak you are." A hush fell over the hallway. Maddie's eyes darkened, but before she could spit out a response, a voice interrupted. "Elena." Danny's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He was standing a few feet away, watching with an expression that was unreadable. Elena swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how many eyes were on her. She didn't want to give Maddie another opportunity to twist this into something else. So with one last look at her, she turned and walked away, her heart still racing. But she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Later that evening, as she sat at her desk at home, trying to salvage what was left of her schoolwork, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. "You should have kept the money. You'll need it after I'm done with you." Elena stared at the screen, her fingers tightening around the edges of her phone. Maddie had just declared war, and Elena had never been more ready to fight. The morning after the anonymous message, Elena walked into school with her head held high, refusing to let Maddie see any sign of fear. She had endured Maddie's cruelty for years, but this was something else. The ripped books, the money, the message. It wasn't just bullying anymore. It was a threat. As she stepped into the main hallway, students were already buzzing about something. The way they whispered and pointed in her direction sent a chill down her spine. Something had happened. Elena made her way to her locker, trying to ignore the stares, but the moment she saw it, her stomach dropped. Taped to the metal door was a large printed photo, one that had clearly been doctored. In the image, she was sitting at a restaurant table with an older man, his hand resting on hers, her face edited to make it look as though she were smiling seductively. Beneath the photo, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Guess Maddie was right. Who knew Elena had a side hustle?" Laughter exploded around her. Heat rose to Elena's face, her fingers trembling as she ripped the paper down. It was fake, she knew that. But the damage was done. People were already believing it. "What the hell is this?" a familiar voice said from behind her. Elena turned to see Danny, his jaw clenched, his gaze flicking between the paper and the snickering students around them. His expression darkened. "This is Maddie," Elena muttered, her voice thick with frustration. Danny didn't hesitate. He spun on his heel and stormed down the hall. Elena hesitated for half a second before following. She already knew where he was going. Sure enough, Maddie was in the student lounge, lounging on one of the expensive couches like she had personally built the school herself. Her friends sat around her laughing, sipping their overpriced lattes from the on-campus cafe. Danny didn't wait for an invitation. He marched straight up to Maddie and slammed the photo onto the table in front of her. "Are you serious?" he demanded. Maddie barely glanced at it. Oh, that! She sighed dramatically. I don't know where it came from. But, I mean, the picture speaks for itself, doesn't it? Danny's fists clenched. You edited this. You're trying to destroy her. Maddie shrugged. Or maybe Elena's just been hiding who she really is. Elena stepped forward, her voice ice cold. This is pathetic, even for you. Maddie tilted her head, her fake concern nauseating. Oh, Elena, honey. If you don't like people talking about you, maybe stop giving them reasons too. A few of her friends chuckled, but others shifted uncomfortably. Even Maddie's usual crowd wasn't completely on board with whatever this was. Danny's voice was low, dangerous. Take it down. Maddie smirked. Sorry, Danny. But once something's on the internet, well, you know how it is. It never really goes away. Elena's hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream, wanted to tear Maddie's smug expression off her face. But she knew that's what Maddie wanted, for her to explode, to lose control. So instead she smiled. Maddie frowned. Thanks for proving my point, Elena said smoothly. I always knew you were obsessed with me. But this is next level, the crowd murmured. Maddie's expression twisted. Excuse me. Elena stepped even closer, lowering her voice so only Maddie could hear. You're terrified of me, aren't you? That's why you can't stop talking about me. Why you can't stop trying to ruin me. Maddie's nostrils flared. You're delusional. Elena just smiled again. Am I? Maddie's jaw tightened, but before she could snap back, Danny leaned in. Take it down, Maddie. Now. For a moment, it looked like Maddie was actually considering it. But then, she plastered on her usual smirk. No. Danny exhaled sharply, shaking his head. All right, your choice. Elena frowned. What does that mean? Danny met Maddie's eyes, his own gaze unreadable. You'll find out. With that, he turned and walked away. Elena followed, her mind racing. What are you planning? She asked, when they were out of earshot. Danny pulled out his phone, typing something quickly. I have a friend. He's good with this kind of thing. Maddie thinks she's untouchable, but she forgets that people like her always leave a trail. Elena blinked. You mean? Danny smirked. I mean, if she wants to play dirty, let's see how she likes it when someone fights back. For the first time in days, Elena felt something other than anger or exhaustion. Hope. Elena had barely slept the night before. The fake image, the whispers, the knowing smirks, it was all too much. She had fought Maddie's cruelty for years, but this was the worst attack yet. The worst part wasn't the rumors. It was the knowledge that people wanted to believe them. That no matter how hard she worked, how much she proved herself, some would always see her as nothing more than a scholarship girl who didn't belong. But this time she wasn't fighting alone. By the time she arrived at school the next morning, the atmosphere had shifted. People were staring at their phones, some whispering, others outright gasping. The usual group of Maddie's followers sat huddled together in the lounge, eyes wide, scrolling through their screens. Elena's heart pounded as she made her way to her locker. She barely had time to open it before Danny appeared at her side, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "You're welcome," he said casually. Elena turned to him, brows furrowed. Danny held up his phone and turned the screen toward her. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. But then, as the words sank in, her breath caught. Maddie Sinclair exposed the truth behind the fake wealth. Beneath the bold headline were screenshots, bankruptcy filings, court records, and even old photos of Maddie before Wellington, before the designer clothes and luxury cars. A detailed post accompanied them, outlining how the Sinclairs had lost almost everything years ago, but had been faking their wealth to keep up appearances. Maddie wasn't rich. She was pretending. Elena's mouth went dry. Where did this come from? Danny shrugged, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I told you I had a friend." Elena stared at him. You didn't actually do this, did you?" Danny's smirk faded. "I didn't have to. The truth was already out there. All it took was someone willing to look." Elena's mind spun. Maddie had spent years tormenting her, making her feel like she was nothing. And now everyone knew Maddie's perfect life was nothing more than a carefully crafted lie. The cafeteria doors burst open. Maddie stormed inside, phone clenched tightly in her hand, her usually flawless composure completely shattered. "Who did this?" she shrieked, her voice breaking. No one answered. The entire room was frozen, watching as the queen bee of Wellington Academy cracked before their eyes. Elena had never seen Maddie look this way, panicked, vulnerable, desperate. The realization hit her hard. Maddie wasn't just mean, she was terrified. Maddie's wild gaze locked onto Elena, and before Elena could react, she was in front of her, eyes blazing. "It was you, wasn't it?" Maddie hissed. "You think this makes us even?" Elena's pulse pounded in her ears. She didn't do this, but a part of her couldn't deny that it felt like justice. "I didn't need to do anything, Maddie," Elena said quietly. "The truth was already there." Maddie's hands trembled. For a moment, Elena thought she might actually cry. But instead, Maddie did what she did best. She lashed out. "You think this makes you better than me?" she spat. "You think just because you have good grades and a stupid bicycle, you win?" Elena took a deep breath. "I never wanted to win, Maddie. I just wanted you to leave me alone." Maddie's face twisted with rage, but something else lurked beneath it. Fear. "You don't understand," she whispered, voice shaking. Elena frowned. "Then make me understand." Maddie clenched her jaw, glancing around as if realizing just how many people were watching. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, leaving behind only stunned silence. Danny exhaled, shaking his head. Well, that was dramatic. Elena barely heard him. Something about Maddie's last words echoed in her mind. "You don't understand." For the first time, she wondered if Maddie's cruelty had been hiding something much darker all along. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Maddie had humiliated her countless times before, but this wasn't the reaction of a girl who had simply lost control of the narrative. This was something else. It was fear. The revelation about Maddie's family's bankruptcy spread through Wellington Academy like wildfire. The same people who once followed her around, hanging on to her every word, now whispered behind her back. The same students who had laughed at Elena's expense were now laughing at Maddie's downfall. It was a brutal shift, and for the first time, Maddie was the one walking through the halls with her head down. Elena should have felt victorious. She should have felt relieved, but instead she felt uneasy. That evening, she sat on the worn-out couch in her grandmother's living room, flipping through her textbooks, but her mind was elsewhere. The house smelled like chamomile tea, and the soft hum of the old radio played in the background. Her grandmother, Mrs. Carter, sat across from her, knitting like she always did. She had always been Elena's rock, her source of wisdom and comfort. "You're quiet tonight," her grandmother said, not looking up from her knitting. Elena hesitated. "There's a girl at school. She's been horrible to me for years. But today something happened, and now I don't know what to think." Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Elena sighed. "She's not who she pretended to be. She acted like she was better than everyone. But it turns out her family lost everything a long time ago, and now the whole school knows." Her grandmother set her knitting down, studying Elena carefully. "And how do you feel about that?" Elena chewed her bottom lip. "I thought I'd feel good about it, but I don't. She was awful to me, Grandma. She made my life miserable. And yet, when I saw her break today, She exhaled. "I just don't think I've ever seen her look that scared." Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. "Sometimes people who hurt others are the ones who are hurting the most." Elena shook her head. "I don't want to feel bad for her, but I do." Her grandmother reached out, squeezing her hand. "That's because you have a kind heart, my child. And no matter what happens, don't let the world take that away from you." Elena sat with those words for a long time. The next morning, as she walked into school, she expected Maddie to be absent, to have disappeared from Wellington altogether. But Maddie was there, sitting alone at a table in the cafeteria, her usual entourage nowhere in sight. It was an unfamiliar sight. Maddie Sinclair, the Queen of Wellington, utterly alone. Elena wasn't sure what she was doing as she crossed the cafeteria. Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. Before she knew it, she was standing across from Maddie's table. Maddie looked up, her eyes tired, her makeup slightly smudged like she hadn't bothered fixing it that morning. She scoffed. "What do you want? Come to gloat." Elena pulled out a chair and sat down. "No." Maddie narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here?" Elena hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it, how to tell Maddie that, despite everything, she didn't want to see her destroyed. So instead, she asked, "Are you okay?" Maddie blinked, genuinely caught off guard. Then she laughed, but it wasn't her usual cruel, confident laugh. It was hollow. "Wow," she muttered, shaking her head. "Of all people, you're the one asking me that." Elena shrugged. "Just because you've been awful to me doesn't mean I want to see you fall apart." Maddie exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Well, don't worry about me. I'll survive." Elena studied her for a long moment. "Who was that man?" she finally asked. Maddie's jaw clenched. "What?" "The man in the car. The one who told you to call him. Who was he? Maddie stiffened, her entire body going rigid. She shook her head, her voice sharp. None of your business. Elena didn't back down. Maddie, if you're in trouble. I said, drop it, Maddie snapped, standing up so quickly her chair scraped against the tile floor. She grabbed her bag, slinging it over her shoulder. You don't know anything about me, Elena. Stop pretending you care. And with that, she stormed off. Elena watched her go, Maddie's words swirling in her mind. She wasn't pretending. She did care. And that scared her more than anything. Elena had always believed that truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. But sometimes, the truth wasn't just something waiting to be found. It was something that could shatter a person's entire world. The weight of Maddie's reaction lingered with her for the rest of the day. There was something in Maddie's voice when she snapped, something raw, something more than just anger. It wasn't the reaction of a girl who had lost her social status. It was the reaction of someone afraid. By the time school ended, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. She knew she shouldn't care. After everything Maddie had put her through, why should she? But something in her gut told her that this wasn't just about high school drama. This was deeper. As she walked home, pushing her bicycle along the cracked pavement, she replayed the morning's conversation over and over and over in her head. The way Maddie had tensed at the mention of the man in the car, the way she had practically run when Elena pressed her about it. Elena sighed, shaking her head. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe Maddie was just humiliated and looking for someone to lash out at. Or maybe there was something she wasn't saying. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages of her ruined notebooks, her grandmother called her name softly. Elena, my child. Elena looked up. Mrs. Carter was sitting in her usual chair, her frail hands folded in her lap. But tonight there was something different in her eyes. A heaviness. Elena immediately sat up straighter. Grandma, what's wrong? Her grandmother hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. Then she sighed. There is something I need to tell you. Elena frowned. Okay. Mrs. Carter reached for Elena's hand, squeezing it gently. I should have told you this a long time ago, but I was afraid. Elena's stomach twisted. Afraid of what? Her grandmother's voice wavered. Afraid of losing you. Elena blinked. I don't understand. Mrs. Carter inhaled shakily. Elena, I am not your real grandmother. For a moment, the words didn't process. They felt foreign, impossible, like she had misheard them. What? She whispered. Mrs. Carter's eyes filled with tears. I took you when you were a baby. You weren't mine to raise, but I couldn't bear to leave you. Elena's heart pounded, the walls around her suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. You? What do you mean, you took me? Mrs. Carter's voice cracked. Your real mother was just a young girl, Elena. She was scared, alone. I was working at the hospital when she gave birth to you and when she disappeared and made a choice, a terrible choice, a terrible choice. Elena felt like the floor beneath her was crumbling. You stole me. Tears spilled down her grandmother's face. I raised you as my own because I loved you. I never meant to hurt you. I only wanted to protect you. Elena shot up from her chair, her pulse roaring in her ears. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Her whole life, everything she thought she knew, it was all a lie. She staggered back, shaking her head. No, no, this doesn't make sense. You said my parents died. I lied, her grandmother whispered. I was afraid you would leave me if you knew the truth. Elena's breathing was shallow, her hands trembling. She had spent her entire life believing she was alone in the world. But now there was a mother out there somewhere who had been searching for her. Or maybe she hadn't. Elena's voice was barely audible. Who is she? Her grandmother's face crumpled. I don't know. I never found out her name. I only know that she was young, and she was young, and she was terrified. Elena's hands curled into fists. So you just took me, just decided I was yours. I'm sorry, her grandmother whispered. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. Elena felt like she couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run. But where? She had nowhere to go. Her world had just shattered, and she didn't even know where the pieces were. Without another word, she turned and rushed out the door, the night air hitting her like a slap. She needed space. She needed answers. And somehow, she knew that this was only the beginning. Elena ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away, away from the house that no longer felt like home, away from the truth that had torn through her life like a hurricane. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. The woman she had called her grandmother wasn't her real grandmother. The life she had been built on a lie. And worst of all, her real mother, whoever she was, had been out there all along, maybe searching for her, maybe not. Elena had spent her whole life thinking she didn't belong at Wellington Academy. Now, she didn't know if she belonged anywhere. She slowed down when she reached the edge of town, her legs burning, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. The streets were quiet. The streets were quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. She leaned against a bench, trying to steady her breathing, but her thoughts wouldn't stop spiraling. Then, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She almost ignored it, but something told her to look. The screen lit up with a single message. Danny, where are you? Elena hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She could lie, say she was fine, say she was home. But for the first time in her life, she didn't have the energy to pretend. Elena, I don't know. A moment passed, then another message came through. Danny, stay there. I'm coming. She should have told him not to. She should have told him to leave her alone. But instead, she just sat down on the bench, staring at the cracks in the sidewalk, waiting. 15 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The passenger window rolled down, and Danny leaned over the console, his face etched with concern. Get in! Elena hesitated for only a second before climbing in. The car was warm, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence as Danny pulled away from the curb. He didn't ask questions right away. He just drove, letting the quiet settle between them. It wasn't until they reached a lookout point on the edge of town that he finally spoke. "Want to tell me what's going on?" Elena stared out at the city lights below. "I don't even know where to start." Danny turned off the engine and shifted to face her. "Try me." She swallowed hard. "Everything I thought I knew about my life." Danny's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Elena exhaled shakily. "My grandmother. She's not really my grandmother. She took me when I was a baby. My real mother is out there somewhere, and I have no idea who she is." Danny didn't react right away. He just sat there, letting the weight of her words settle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Jesus, Elena?" She let out a hollow laugh. "Yeah, pretty much my reaction." Danny ran a hand through his hair. "So what are you going to do?" Elena shook her head. "I don't know. I don't even know where to start." For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Danny shifted, pulling out his phone. "What are you doing?" she asked. He glanced at her. "We start looking." Elena's throat tightened. "Danny." "You deserve answers," he said simply. "And if your grandmother can't give them to you, we'll find them ourselves." Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the certainty in his voice. She had never had someone fight for her before. Not like this. She nodded slowly. "Okay." Danny's lips quirked up in a small smile. "Good." As they sat there, the city stretched out before them. Elena felt something she hadn't felt in hours. Hope. Elena had never imagined that searching for the truth about her past would feel like chasing shadows. The more she tried to grasp something solid, the more it slipped through her fingers. But she wasn't alone. For the past few days, Danny had been relentless. He had reached out to contacts, combed through online records, and even convinced one of his tech-savvy friends to dig into old hospital databases. It was more than Elena had expected, more than she had ever thought anyone would do for her. But still, they had nothing. Elena sat on the floor of Danny's living room, surrounded by scattered papers and notes they had taken. Hospital records, missing persons reports, anything that might lead to her real mother. But it was like searching for a ghost. Danny dropped onto the couch behind her with a sigh. "We're missing something," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. Elena pressed her fingers to her temples, exhausted. "Or maybe there's nothing to find." Danny shook his head. "No, there's always something. We just have to figure out where to look." Elena exhaled slowly, staring down at a faded newspaper article they had printed out. It was from over a decade ago, a small column about a teenage girl who had given birth and disappeared from the hospital before anyone could identify her. What if she never wanted to be found? Elena said quietly. Danny hesitated. "Do you believe that?" She swallowed. "I don't know." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Danny's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brows lifting slightly. "It's my friend, the one who's been helping us." Elena's heart pounded as he answered. "Tell me you found something," Danny said immediately. A voice on the other end spoke rapidly, but Elena couldn't make out the words. Danny's expression shifted. First surprise, then something deeper, something sharp. "What?" he said, sitting up straighter. "Are you serious?" Elena's stomach twisted. "What is it?" Danny put the call on speaker. The hospital records were a dead end, the voice on the phone said. But I dug into old police reports from that same year. There was an anonymous call made to child services about a baby being taken from the hospital. Elena's breath caught. And guess where the call came from? The voice continued. Danny's eyes locked onto Elena's. The Sinclair estate. Elena felt like the ground had just disappeared beneath her. "The Sinclairs?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. Danny's friend continued. "It was never followed up on. Too many dead ends, too many people unwilling to talk. But someone at the Sinclair residence knew something. Maybe they still do." Elena's pulse roared in her ears. "Maddie." Danny ended the call, his gaze unreadable. "Elena." She shot up from the floor. "I have to talk to her." Danny stood, blocking her path. "Wait. Just think about this for a second. If Maddie or her family knew something all this time, why wouldn't they have said anything?" Elena shook her head, her mind spinning. "I don't know, but I have to find out." Danny exhaled, then nodded. "Okay, but I'm coming with you." Elena didn't argue. They arrived at the Sinclair estate just before sunset. The massive gates were partially open, as if expecting someone. The house itself loomed ahead, all sharp lines and cold glass, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine rather than real life. Elena had been here once before, at a school fundraiser Maddie's mother had hosted. But tonight it felt different, heavier. Danny rang the doorbell. A few moments later, the door opened and Maddie stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she said coolly. Elena ignored the venom in her voice. "We need to talk." Maddie raised a perfectly sculpted brow. "About what?" Elena took a deep breath. "About my mother." For the first time, Maddie's mask cracked. It was brief, just a flicker of something in her eyes. But Elena saw it. Maddie tried to recover, scoffing. "What the hell are you talking about?" Danny stepped forward. "We know someone in this house made a call the night Elena was taken from the hospital." Maddie's expression darkened. "You don't know anything." Elena's voice was steady. "Then tell me the truth." Maddie hesitated, and for the first time in their long, bitter history, Elena saw something in her, something she had never expected. Guilt. Elena's breath caught. "You do know something." Maddie exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. I can't." Before she could finish, a new voice echoed from inside the house. "Madeline?" Elena's stomach twisted as Maddie's mother appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "What is going on here?" Mrs. Sinclair's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it. Elena met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I think you know." For a second, just a second, something flickered in Mrs. Sinclair's expression. Then, without another word, she stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come inside." Elena stepped into the Sinclair estate with Danny close behind her. The air inside was thick with an unfamiliar tension, the grand chandeliers casting a cold artificial glow over the pristine marble floors. Mrs. Sinclair led them into a sitting room, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. Maddie trailed behind, arms crossed tightly over her chest, looking anywhere but at Elena. Elena could hear the steady ticking of an antique clock in the corner, but it felt like time had stopped. She had spent her whole life wondering where she came from, and now the answers were just within reach. Mrs. Sinclair finally spoke. "You think I know something about your mother." It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. "I don't think. I know. Someone in this house made the call about me the night I was taken, and I want to know why." For a moment, Mrs. Sinclair said nothing. Then she turned to Maddie. "Leave us." Maddie's head snapped up. "What? No. If you're about to." "Madeline." Maddie flinched at the warning in her mother's voice, her jaw tightening. She lingered for a second, then stormed out, the sharp click of her heels echoing down the hall. Elena felt Danny shift beside her, his presence grounding her. She took a deep breath. "Just tell me the truth." Mrs. Sinclair exhaled slowly, her mask of indifference slipping just slightly. "I knew this day would come." Elena's heart pounded. Mrs. Sinclair gestured for them to sit. Elena and Danny hesitated, but eventually they did. Mrs. Sinclair folded her hands neatly in her lap, her gaze far away, as if looking into a past she had long tried to forget. "You were born in the middle of a storm," she said. "You were born in the middle of a storm," she said. "Your mother was young, too young, and terrified. She came to the hospital alone. No." Elena swallowed hard. Mrs. Sinclair's voice softened, just barely. "I was on the hospital board at the time. My job was to keep everything in order. And then she showed up, a girl with nothing, holding a baby she wasn't ready for. I remember the way she looked at you, like she wanted so desperately to give you the world, but didn't know how." Elena's hands curled into fists. "Where is she now?" Mrs. Sinclair hesitated. "I don't know." Elena's stomach twisted. "You're lying." Mrs. Sinclair sighed. "I don't know where she is now, but I know what happened that night." She glanced at Danny, then back at Elena. "Your mother didn't abandon you, Elena. She never meant to leave you behind." Elena's breath caught. "Then why did she?" Mrs. Sinclair leaned forward. "Because she was forced to." The words sent a cold shiver down Elena's spine. She wasn't alone that night. Mrs. Sinclair continued. "There was a man, older, controlling. I could see it in the way he spoke for her, the way he held her arm too tightly." Elena felt like she couldn't breathe. "He told her to leave you," Mrs. Sinclair said. "Told her she had no choice. I don't know who he was, but I know this. Your mother didn't want to go. She fought, she cried, but in the end, she left. And the next morning, you were gone too." Elena's pulse roared in her ears. "Gone?" Mrs. Sinclair's expression darkened. "The hospital said a woman had taken you, that she had posed as a nurse and disappeared with you before security could intervene. The police searched, but there were no leads. The trail went cold." Elena's throat tightened. "That woman was my grandmother." Mrs. Sinclair nodded. Then she must have gotten to you before he could. Elena's mind was spinning. And you never tried to find me? Mrs. Sinclair's face hardened. Elena, you have to understand. Whoever that man was, he was dangerous. I could feel it. If I had gone digging, I might have put your mother at risk. Or you. Elena wanted to scream. How many lives had been ruined because of a single night? How many years had been stolen from her because of a choice she never got to make? Danny's hand found hers, squeezing gently, reminding her she wasn't alone. Elena took a shaky breath. So what now? Mrs. Sinclair studied her. That's up to you. Elena exhaled, her hands trembling. She had come looking for answers, and she had found them. But the truth didn't bring the closure she thought it would. If anything, it only opened more wounds. Her mother had wanted her. Her mother had fought for her. And someone had taken her away. She didn't know where to go from here, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done searching. Not yet. Life lessons from the story. At its core, this story is about resilience, truth, and the power of self-worth. Elena's journey was not just about uncovering her past. It was about finding her place in a world that constantly tried to push her down. She faced humiliation, betrayal, and heartbreaking revelations, yet she never let those obstacles define her. Instead, she used them as fuel to push forward. One of the most valuable lessons we can take from Elena's story is that true strength is not about winning every battle. It's about refusing to be broken by them. She was mocked for her background, but she never let it make her feel less than. She was lied to, but she chose to seek the truth instead of living in ignorance. She was wronged, but she never became like those who hurt her. Another key lesson is that people are not always what they seem. Maddie's cruelty was a mask for her own fears and insecurities, proving that those who try the hardest to tear others down are often fighting battles of their own. And sometimes, the ones who seem the most powerful are the most fragile inside. Most importantly, this story reminds us that our worth is not determined by where we come from, how much money we have, or the opinions of others. What truly matters is our character. The choices we make, the kindness we show, and the courage to stand tall even when the world tries to break us. If this story resonated with you, let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and keep you on the edge of your seat. See you in the next one.